In the last decade of the 20th century, the U.S. Department of Education committed billions of dollars to an initiative called Reading First, with the aim of improving reading among schoolchildren nationwide. It's a mark of how scientifically backward and benighted much of our professional reading establishment is that when the directors of this program consulted, quote, experts, end quote, and asked them to outline the areas of focus to be addressed by Reading First and assessed by reading examinations, those experts included among items to be addressed by the program students' decoding skills, phonemic awareness and phonics, vocabulary, and comprehension, but completely ignored grammatical fluency. However, and this ought to be obvious, written texts consist of sentences that have particular syntactic patterns. If students cannot automatically, that is, fluently and unconsciously, parse the syntactic patterns being used, then they might have some idea what the subject of the text is, but they won't have a ghost of a chance of understanding what the text is saying. Syntactic complexity is, of course, a significant determinant of complexity and readability. Consider the opening two sentences of the Declaration of Independence. Sentence 1. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare which impel them to the separation. Sentence 2. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness. Let's think about those sentences. These sentences contain a few vocabulary items that might be challenging to young people: impelled, endowed, and unalienable. But for the most part, the words used have high frequency and present no great challenge. The most significant stumbling block for comprehension of these sentences is their syntactic complexity. The first sentence consists of a long adverbial clause beginning with "when in the course" and ending with "entitle them," that specifies the conditions under which it is necessary to take the action described in a main clause that follows it, that is, a decent respect, ... the separation. The second sentence consists of a main clause that introduces a list in the form of 5 clauses, each specifying a truth held to be self-evident. Note that current readability formulas use sentence length as an extremely rough stand-in for syntactic complexity. This sort of works, but only sort of. Sentences can be short and syntactically complex, or complex in many other ways, in their references, their use of figures, their challenge to conventional thinking, and so on. That's one reason why readability calculations should be taken with a big grain of salt. Here's the point. The student who cannot follow the basic syntactic form of these sentences from the Declaration will be completely lost. He or she won't understand how a given idea in one of these sentences relates to another idea in them, for that is what syntax does. It relates ideas in particular ways. An automatic, fluid grasp of the syntax of a sentence is critical to comprehending what it means. That's true of complicated sentences like these from the Declaration of Independence, and it's true of sentences in general. One can't comprehend them if one cannot parse their syntax automatically, that is, quickly and unconsciously. Grammatical competence is one of the keys to decoding, and decoding is a prerequisite for comprehension. So why didn't our so-called reading experts grok that? Well, because they're not very expert. So, are schools today ensuring via their instructional methods and assessments that students are gaining the automatic syntactic fluency necessary for decoding? Well, no. No. In fact, they are implementing materials based on a folk theory of grammar that predates the current scientific model of language acquisition. Consider, for example, this gem from the backward, puerile Common Core state standards in language arts, which provide the current goals and disastrously the de facto outline for instruction in English and reading. According to the Common Core standards, an 8th grade student should be able to, quote, explain the function of verbals, gerunds, participles, infinitives in general and their function in particular sentences. The other grammar-related standards in the CCSS are similar. They all show that at the highest levels in our educational establishment, there is a complete lack of understanding of what science now tells us about how the grammar of a language is acquired. The standard instantiates a pre-scientific folk theory of grammar that assumes that grammatical competence is explicitly acquired and is available for explicit description by someone who consciously, quote, knows, end quote, it. Explain the function. Explicit knowledge. This standard tells us that the students are to be instructed in and assessed on the ability to A, explain the function of verbals, gerunds, participles, and infinitives in general, and B, their function in particular sentences. Now let's think for a moment about that. In order for students to be able to do this, they will have to be taught how to identify gerunds, participles, and infinitives, and how to explain their functions generally and in particular sentences. In order for the standard to be met, these bits of grammatical taxonomy will have to be explicitly taught and explicitly learned, for the standard requires students to be able to make explicit explanations. Now, there is a difference between having learned an explicit grammatical taxonomy and having acquired competence in using the grammatical forms listed in that taxonomy. Clearly, the authors of the standard seem not to have understood this fundamental principle from contemporary linguistics. Let's think about the kind of activity that this, quote, standard, end quote, envisions having our students do. Identifying the functions of verbals in sentences would require students to be able to do, among other things, something like this. Underline the gerund phrases in the following sentences and tell whether each is functioning as a subject, direct object, indirect object, object of a preposition, predicate nominative, retained object, subjective complement, objective complement, or a positive of any of these. That's what the standard asks us to teach students to do, explicitly. That's what's entailed by just part of the, quote, standard, end quote. And since this standard just mentions verbals generally and not any of the many forms that these can take, one doesn't know whether it covers, for example, infinitives used without the infinitive marker to, so-called bare infinitives, as in let there be peace. Compare John wanted there to be peace. Obviously, just meeting this one standard would require years, I mean literally years, of explicit formal instruction in syntax. And what contemporary linguistic science teaches us is that all of that instruction would be completely irrelevant to students being able to formulate and comprehend sentences. The authors of the new, quote, standards, end quote, paid for by Bill Gates and foisted upon the country with almost no vetting, clearly, sadly, tragically, understood nothing of this. Okay, what didn't they understand? Contemporary linguistic science teaches that grammatical competence is acquired not through explicit instruction in grammatical forms, but rather automatically, fluently, and unconsciously via the operation of an internal mechanism dedicated to such learning. A specific example will make the point quite clear. If you are a native speaker of English, you know that the green great dragon sounds weird, is ungrammatical, and that the great green dragon sounds fine. Green great dragon versus great green dragon. That's because, based on the ambient linguistic environment in which you came of age, you intuited automatically, without your being aware that you were doing so, a complex set of rules governing the proper ordering of adjectives in a series. Now, note this. No one taught you explicitly these rules governing the order of precedence of adjectives in English. And the chances are good that you cannot even state the rules that you nonetheless, in some sense, know. But in the sense that you have acquired these rules unconsciously and automatically and apply them unconsciously and automatically. And what's true of this set of rules is true of all but a minuscule portion of the grammar of a language that a speaker, quote, knows, end quote, that he or she can use. Knowledge of grammar is like knowledge of how to walk. It is not conscious knowledge. The walker did not learn to do so by studying the physics of motion and the operation of motor neurons and bones and muscles. The brain and body are designed in such a way as to do these things automatically. The same is true, contemporary linguistic science teaches us, of the learning of the grammar of a language. Let me give an example, another example. Speakers and writers of English follow hundreds of thousands of rules like the C command condition on the binding of anaphors, a key component of the syntax of languages worldwide. Now, C command is a fairly complex rule, and I'm not going to take the time to explain it here. People follow this rule that they know nothing about explicitly. Following this rule, they will say, the president may blame himself, but would never say, supporters of the president may blame himself, which violates the C command rule on the binding of anaphors. They follow the rule even though they were never taught the rule explicitly and could not explain, unless they have had an introductory syntax course, what the rule is that they have been following all their lives. Since the groundbreaking work by Noam Chomsky in the 1950s, we have developed a robust scientific model of how the grammar of a language is acquired. It is acquired unconsciously and automatically by an internal language acquisition mechanism or device. Like many great thinkers, Chomsky started with a simple question, asking himself how it is possible that most children gain a reasonable degree of mastery over something as complicated as a spoken language. With almost no direct instruction, almost every child learns within a few years' time enough of his or her language to be able to communicate with ease most of what he or she wishes to communicate. This learning seems not to be correlated with a child's general intelligence and fails to occur only when there is a physical problem with the child's brain or in conditions of deprivation in which the child has limited exposure to language. If one looks scientifically at what a child knows of his or her language at the age of, say, 6 or 7, it turns out that that knowledge is extraordinarily complex. But it's not explicit knowledge. Furthermore, almost all of what the child knows has not been directly or explicitly taught. For example, long before going to school and without being taught what direct objects and objects of prepositions are, an English-speaking child understands that the first sentence that follows sounds right and the second sentence does not. Tokyo is Japan's capital. Tokyo, Japan's capital is. In other words, on some level, the English-speaking child knows that direct objects follow and do not precede the verbs that govern them, even though he or she has no clue what objects and verbs are. The Japanese child, in contrast, knows just as well that in Japanese objects precede and do not follow the verbs that govern them. The sentence in Japan is the Tokyo wa Nihon no shuto desu. Tokyo, subject particle, Japan, possessive particle, capital is. So, imagine that the sentences above were translated word by word into Japanese and that the word order were retained. To a Japanese child, the word order of the first of these sentences, Tokyo is Japan's capital, would sound quite strange, while the word order of the second, Tokyo, Japan's capital is, would seem unexceptional. Just the opposite from English. English is a head-first language, in which the head of a grammatical phrase precedes its objects and complements. So in the verb phrase, is Japan's capital, the verb is comes first. Japanese is a head-last language, in which the head of a grammatical phrase follows its objects and complements. So in the Japanese phrase, the verb comes last. Kids are not taught this explicitly. They are born with part of the grammar, the fact that there are heads, objects, and complements, for example, already hardwired into their heads. Then, based upon their ambient linguistic environments, they automatically set certain parameters of the hardwired internal grammar, such as head position. Children do not learn such rules by being taught them any more than a whale learns to echolocate by attending echolocation classes. Chomsky's central insight was that in order for a child to be able to learn a spoken language with such rapidity and thoroughness, that child must be born with large portions of a universal grammar of language already hardwired into his or her head. So, for example, the neural mechanisms that provide for classification of items from the stream of speech into verbs and prepositions and objects, and those mechanisms that allow verbs and prepositions to govern their objects are inborn. They are part of the equipment developed over millennia of evolution with which human children come into the world. Then, when a child hears a particular language, English or Japanese, for example, certain parameters of the inborn language mechanism, such as the position of objects with respect to their governors, are set by a completely unconscious, autonomic process that is itself part of the innate neural machinery for language learning. Because the learning of a grammar is done automatically and unconsciously by the brain, explicit instruction in grammatical forms of the kind called for in the ridiculous pre-scientific Common Core state standards, such instruction is largely irrelevant to learning to speak and read. In fact, such instruction is most likely going to get in the way, much as if one tried to teach a child to walk by making him or her memorize the names of relevant muscles, nerves, and skeletal structures, or tried to teach a baseball player how to hit by teaching him or her calculus to describe the aerodynamics of baseballs in motion. In other words, the national standard is based on a pre-scientific understanding of how grammar is acquired. This should be a national scandal. It's as though we had new standards for tactics for the U.S. Navy that warned against the possibility of sailing off the edge of the earth. That's how much the authors of these, quote, standards, end quote, understood the topic they presumed to pontificate about. Don't get me started on the Common Core state standards. They have been ruinous, and there will be a lot of videos coming on that topic. To return to the main topic, we have seen above that grammatical fluency and automaticity is an essential prerequisite to reading comprehension. So if such fluency and automaticity is not gained via explicit instruction, how is it to be acquired? The answer is quite simple. The child has to be exposed to an ambient linguistic environment containing increasingly complex syntactic structures over time so that the language acquisition device in the brain has the material on which to work to put together automatically its model of the language. So, why do some kids have early on a great deal of syntactic competence while other kids do not? The answer should be obvious from the foregoing. Some were raised in syntactically rich linguistic environments and some weren't. In 2003, Betty Hart and Todd R. Risley of the University of Kansas published a study showing that students from low-income families were exposed before the age of 3 to 30 million fewer words, to a lot less language, than were students from high-income families. A later, much larger attempted replication found a 4 million word gap. Unfortunately, these studies did not report disparities in total number and frequency of lexemes and in the syntactic complexity of the ambient linguistic environment. Grad students, Hart and Risley focused on vocabulary, but note that some superb doctoral theses could be written on the differences in the syntactic and morphological completeness of the grammars internalized by kids raised in poverty and wealth. Kids living in extreme poverty often aren't taught too much. They don't hear sentences that are syntactically complex. They are talked at. An impoverished diet of imperatives, shut up, go play outside, does not make for linguistic nutritional adequacy. Shockingly, however, what so-called reading comprehension specialists commonly do in their classroom mirrors what happens to kids from impoverished families and is precisely the opposite of what is required by the language acquisition device, or LAD. Instead of providing syntactically complex materials as part of the child's ambient linguistic environment so that the LAD can learn those forms automatically and incorporate them into the child's unconscious working syntax, these reading, quote, professionals, end quote, intentionally use with children what are known as leveled readers. These intentionally contain short and thus usually syntactically impoverished sentences that will come out, quote, at grade level, quote, according to simplistic and simple-minded readability formulas like Lexile and Flesch-Kincaid. The readability formulas used to level these texts put before children vary in minor details, but almost all are based on sentence length and word frequency, how frequently the words used in the text occur in some language collection known as a corpus. Shorter sentences are, of course, statistically likely to be syntactically simple. So, as a direct result of the method of text selection, complex syntactic forms are de facto banished from the textbooks and other reading materials used in reading classes. Teachers go off to education schools to take their master's degrees and doctorates in reading, where they learn to use such formulas to ensure that reading is, quote, on grade level, end quote. And by using such formulas, they inadvertently deprive kids of precisely the material that they need to be exposed to in order for their language acquisition devices in their heads to do their work. After years of exposure to nothing but texts that have been intentionally syntactically impoverished, the students have not developed the necessary syntactic fluency for adult reading. When confronted with real-world texts, with their embedded relative and subordinate clauses, verbal phrases, appositives, absolute constructions, correlative constructions, and so on, they can't make heads or tails of what is being said because the sentences are syntactically opaque. A sentence from the Declaration of Independence, the Scarlet Letter, a legal document, or a technical manual might as well be written in Swahili or Klingon or Linear B. So, what can be done to ensure that students develop syntactic fluency, grammatical fluency? I'm not suggesting that students be given texts too difficult for them to comprehend, obviously. I am saying that they must be given texts that are challenging syntactically, that present them with syntactic forms that they cannot, at their stage of development, completely parse automatically. That is, in the argot of education professors, after Vygotsky, texts that are syntactically at kids' zone of proximal development. For it is only by this means that the innate grammar learning mechanism can operate to expand the student's syntactic range. But even before that, students who come from linguistically impoverished environments, the ones who have almost never had the experience of having conversations with adults and arrive in school barely articulate in their spoken language, need remedial exposure to language, spoken language, rich in morphological and syntactic forms, and in related domain-specific vocabulary, but more about that in the next talk. The second of these is almost never done. Here are a few techniques to so expose students. Identify, via diagnostic testing, the common spoken morphological and syntactic forms that the student has not acquired and does not use. Grad students, start developing those. In conversation with students, use increasingly morphological and syntactically complex language to which the child has not been exposed. This is not done systematically now, but it needs to be. Present students with texts that are routinely just above their current level of syntactic decoding ability. Have them listen to syntactically complex texts, because syntactic decoding of spoken language outpaces syntactic decoding of written language. Have them memorize passages containing complex syntactic constructions. Have them do sentence combining and sentence expansion exercises. And most of all, as soon as they can begin to do so with difficulty, have them read real-world materials, novels and essays and nonfiction books that have not been leveled, but that are high interest enough to repay their effort. That such materials will contain difficult-to-parse constructions is precisely the point. Those are the materials on which the internal language acquisition device works to acquire grammatical competence. Note that memorization used to be a big part of instruction in the 19th century. That really needs to return. By memorizing and repeating materials with complex syntactic structures, students learn unconsciously, without being aware of it, the syntactic forms used. But note this, It is valuable to teach kids some very basic traditional grammar, the names of the parts of speech and terms like sentence and phrase and clause. These provide useful terminology for referring to parts of writing when in discussion with students. Some sentence diagramming using tree diagrams can be useful for teaching students to write more complex sentences, and sentence combining expansion and rearrangement exercises in which students are encouraged to create new sentences from old are invaluable for teaching sentence variety. In addition, study of the grammar of language is interesting in and of itself, and I recommend this for older students. What cannot be stressed enough, however, is that explicit teaching of a formal language of a grammar to kids will have almost no effect on either their grammatical competence, on their internalized grammar of the language, or on the frequency of errors in their speech and writing. Unfortunately, many English teachers, having themselves learned the older pre-scientific folk theory of traditional grammar as opposed to contemporary generative syntax, think that when they choose a standard usage over a non-standard one, they are applying their knowledge of traditional grammar rather than their internalized grammatical competence. They aren't, and they are confused about this. Equally unfortunately, many others on the opposite side of the grammar wars don't recognize the value of learning some of the traditional model for the purpose of having a rough and ready language for discussing language. That's also a problem. So, some advice. Yes, teach basic traditional grammar, that is, explicit definitions of forms, to provide a rough language for talking about language. But know why you are doing this teaching, not to instill grammatical competence, which is acquired automatically and unconsciously from exposure to the right linguistic environment, but to provide that basic language for talking about language. Okay, that's it for today. In the next talk in this series, I'm going to address the importance of vocabulary and world knowledge to reading comprehension, and some of the ways in which our current teaching goes wrong because it's not based in science, and what we can do to make sure that kids acquire the necessary vocabulary and world knowledge to understand what they are reading. Okay, make sure to like and subscribe. Listen to the rest of the videos in this series, and check out the other videos on my channel. And thank you for listening.